What's up, everybody? It's Spencer Alessi, and this is the Esports Narrative. This is episode 20, and today I'm talking with Adam Toll. Adam Toll is the CEO of Haste, and they are a network service that reduces lag, packet loss, and jitter during gaming is kind of their thing. So I'd like to hear from you kind of, and furthermore, I'd like to just share that Haste received, I believe it's $2.5 million in seed funding in July from Deep Space Ventures, who was the lead, BLH Venture Partners, Hallett Capital, and Tech Squared Ventures. So you guys got a nice seed round. Adam, tell us how Haste came to be, and what's it been like, starting the company and getting it off the ground?
Yeah, sure. So, the background to be aware of is that my last startup was also based in Atlanta, and that's a whole different story. But that was a company called Big Champagne, and we were kind of a media measurement company. And the person who is my co-founder, really the original inventor of Haste, Tarek Mirza, was one of our senior engineers in that first startup. And that startup went well. We got acquired. We all went our separate ways eventually. And Tarek called me up out of the blue a couple of years ago now, I guess about a year and a half ago, and said, "Hey, Adam, remember how I'm really into gaming?" And I said, "Yeah, of course, I remember." And he started to tell me a story about a few things. He really, I was kind of broadly aware of esports. And this is in 2015, so it was before esports really started, poking its head above the core audience, right? So it was right as the sort of general audience started hearing about esports, right as the New York Times was writing about esports. It was right around that time. And he starts telling me this story about esports. He's been a gamer since he was a kid, going back into the very early days of Dungeons and Dragons and, right up through, video games. And as they started to go online, and he was really into StarCraft, but League was really his game and the one that he really loved. And he started having a lot of frustration with lag. And it's something that I think a lot of people are familiar with. His internet connection was sort of fine, and one day it was not fine. And, he tried to wait it out. He tried, all of the different offerings from the sort of VPN category of lag fixing tools. And nothing really worked for him. And the way he tells it, he thought to himself, look, I know a lot about how networks work. I know a lot about how these games work. He's been developing his own game for many years as kind of a passion project. And he said, I've got this. He had this kind of inspiration about ways that he could sort of create multiple paths and duplicate connections to the game server and a bunch of stuff. And he's telling me this, and he says, Adam, I figured it was like 6 to 8 weeks of my nights and weekend time to sort of hack together a solution, just for myself, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, when he's telling me this, he said, Adam, that was 18 months ago. And today I think I have a few patents. And I think there's a real opportunity here to improve, gaming for this community that I'm a part of. And I'm calling you because you're the guy who's sort of done this before. And I'd love to get any kind of advice you have. And of course, I was delighted.
Of course.
Tarek's a great guy. But no, honestly, at first, I just thought I was kind of giving him a little over the shoulder,
Sure.
Here's some things to think about. But the more I started learning about it, talking to him, learning about it myself, the more excited I got. And so I provided him a little bit of kind of pre-seed capital. We kept working on it together. And next thing I knew, we kind of looked at each other and we were like, hey, man, let's do this together. Let's found the company together and let's do it. And so that was really our origin story. And I think, the one takeaway that I would emphasize in that is that, Tarek is, all of what Haste is goes back to one passionate gamer, my co-founder Tarek, trying to solve lag for himself. And it just blossomed into what today is Haste. So that's how we got started.
Yeah, and that's at its most purest, simplest form. That's how a lot of these companies are formed, right? You have a problem that's maybe just affecting you, and you seek to solve that problem. You later find out that there's a bigger need to solve that problem, and things go on from there.
That's exactly right. And for us, it's been a kind of organic process where out of necessity, we've been very, very focused on the network technology that we're building. We're trying to do something really hard. We like to say we're sort of trying to rewire the internet for real-time, live applications. And that's a big, heavy lift, technically. So we've been mostly focused on that. But now, as we're moving out of our beta phase, we're also really focused on just, the larger ecosystems of tools and really the social experience around gaming and what that means. There's lots of incredible tools, as you know, and as your audience knows, everything from sort of analytics to training applications and, obviously the, things like, in-game VoIP and all of that stuff. And we would love to really support all of those applications and kind of weave them into the Haste experience. And we're starting to do that with with some great companies. You guys should check out Mobalytics. They're really coming out of a heads down mode with some really, really cool analytics for league players. And we're working with them on some integrations and stuff. I also really think that there's a huge opportunity, and this is not necessarily something that, that we're going to solve, but one of the things that I tell people, who maybe are less familiar with, with online gaming and with esports, is, I try and help them understand how social this activity is. Because particularly when you're talking to VC, a lot of them tend to be, of a little bit older generation. I don't mean old, but I mean, they're not in their teens. They're not typically in their 20s. I mean, there are a lot of people there as associates who are. But when you're talking to partners, they tend to be a little bit older. And I think a lot of them, and I think a lot of the general audience have, at least to some degree, they have some sense of gaming and video games as maybe something that looks more like when they were growing up, when games weren't as connected, and maybe before the real explosion in social media in the 2000s. And one of the things I don't think that they really appreciate is how social of an experience gaming is, right? I mean, that it's like, I tell them, you should think of this as much as almost like another kind of social media, through one lens. Obviously, it's many things, but people have their online identities and are communicating with each other and building relationships all through gaming. And I think that's, I think that's a really important part of the fabric. And so at Haste, we first of all are just really proud of our community that we have. We started with we have a Discord channel, that anybody can join. You don't even have to be a Haste user. And it started as a way, early on when we were in alpha and in beta, it was a way for us to support users and to, tell them announcements about downtime and everything. But it really organically of its own, it kind of grew into what is now a really vibrant social community where people are talking about different games. People are talking about, hardware and getting advice about like, hey, I finally saved up for that new video card. Here are the two I'm looking at. What do you guys think? People are finding other people to play with. And so that's something, too, that we really want to be a part of and help to encourage and grow, which is like a social experience around gaming that isn't necessarily part of the walled garden of any one game or any one publisher. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And what you said a few sentences ago about the community and how social it is, I like to say it's like a visceral community. Like gaming and esports is just so much more passionate and visceral than a lot of different things. And in a lot of ways, I think esports and video games in and of itself is going to be a big disruptor, just like Facebook and Twitter and all the social media platforms have been. And I'm curious to get your take, on what's been the value of working with a venture company, and what kind of guidance and mentorship do you get from them, and experience do they relay to you?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, one of the things that I've learned in working with venture is that, there's really just a huge spectrum, right? In terms of the level of involvement, the sort of strategic value, the value as a counselor, there's a huge spectrum. Money is money, right? So, one person's check is the same as another person's check of the same value. That's true. But so much of what anybody, who's starting a company should really be paying attention to is, who are these people? What are their backgrounds? What other types of companies do they invest in? And look, this is like the first thing you'll read if you open any book, that's about entrepreneurship. But it's really true. And I think that there are, in my experience, the sort of first big cut, the first big distinction that I make when I'm talking to an investor is this person I'm talking to a former operator? Meaning, is this somebody who has been in the trenches of building a company? Or is this somebody who, is more of has more of a finance background, right? And hasn't really been operating companies, but is in a finance background. And, I lean towards and of course really appreciate, the people who have had the, operational experience, because that, there's so much practical wisdom there, right? And if you are meeting with your investors and your key investors on a regular basis, it's really like having, additional deeply experienced people who are part of your company. And you can get some really invaluable practical stuff from people who have been operators and who are now investors. But at the same time, it's easy to say that, and it's easy to give more value to the operators, and in some cases, that practical experience is really what you need. But you also read sometimes, people talking about the more sort of people who come from a more financial background being, maybe less helpful for a young startup. And I really think you have to be careful about saying that, because there are incredibly smart people who come from a more pure financial background, and they can help you look at your company in other ways that are really, really important, particularly as you're thinking long term or thinking about sort of big trends in your business model. So I've been super lucky to have great people from both sides of that spectrum. But that's something that I would say, that I would recommend that other entrepreneurs, sort of think about as you're talking to people. Understand what their backgrounds are, and factor that into the way that you talk to them and the way that you sort of use them as a resource.
Yeah, and failure is just part of the process, and in a lot of ways you learn more from your failures than you do with your successes. But what's one of the reasons people fail to succeed with startups, or some of the reasons that are gotchas for someone that's starting their own company?
Yeah, there are so many, and I think the one that I think you see people get hung up on a lot is I think it's easy to kind of be seduced by your own vision. Maybe another way of saying that is to kind of fall in love with your startup. And, we talk about passion a lot, and entrepreneurs who decide to set off and start building their own company, you really do have to be passionate. And that doesn't mean that you have to be outwardly passionate, right? There are some people who aren't, they don't express it outwardly like that, but they are deeply internally passionate about what they're doing. And that's obviously critical. But you also, at a certain point, have to have something of a clinical eye on what your business is and what you're really trying to achieve, and have a sort of, while at the same time that passion is critical, you also, in a sense, at the same time, you have to wear a different mask. You have to be totally dispassionate, and you have to be willing to be kind of brutally honest with yourself. And that is an ongoing process, meaning, if you have a great vision and a great idea, and you really believe in it, and you work your tail off, and you do everything that you should do as an entrepreneur, there is a point at which you have to think about changing your approach, changing your model, approaching a problem in a new way, or even walking away from your startup and saying, you know what, that was a beautiful idea and we did some really great work, but in the end, that's not a business. And that can be really hard, but that kind of conundrum, or that dichotomy between, or that dichotomy of being super passionate and super dispassionate at the same time. It's a hard thing to do, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, and this is obviously not your first rodeo. You mentioned earlier in the show that you started another company and had success there. What's been one of the worst moments for you so far in your entrepreneurial journey or with Haste? Tell us one moment for you that's been particularly difficult and share how you overcame that.
Yeah, I had, I'm thinking back to my first startup, and we bootstrapped that company, right? So meaning we never took any outside investment, which, if you pull it off is great, right? Because you're not really diluting.
You have control. You have all the control. There's no, decision making from another party that you might not be,
That's right.
keen on.
That's right, and there's also no dilution in your ownership, right? So if you do eventually sell the company, you still own all of it, like you and your partners. And as one of the co-founders of the company, along with several other people, that was something that we remain very proud of, that we bootstrapped the company. But at the same time, that meant that, we really kind of ate what we killed, right? We funded the company by revenue from operations, and thankfully we were able to make money, right from the start, which is why we could bootstrap it. But there were some tough times where we as founders, we maxed out our credit cards. You hear that a lot with bootstrap operations. We had started the company when we had all had about 10 years of work under our belts, and so we had some savings, and we were spending those savings, and there were some dark times where I spent sleepless nights, really eating my own spleen over how we were going to make payroll, in a day and a half, where, struggling with a lack of resources, which is what typically comes along with a bootstrapped operation, right? We didn't have a bunch of money investors to forward invest in infrastructure. And, we were just flying by the seat of our pants. and always on the knife's edge, until the company got to a healthier place. And it's a really hard thing to do. It's you sort of have all of your chips on the table, and everything you do is like you feel like it's like every decision is like a life or death of the company decision, and that's a tough place to be. That's a hard and it's a lonely place to be, and it can be a really scary place to be. And I think that's one of the reasons why, startups, tend to skew to a younger crowd, because the amount of risk, is really high. And, so anyway, we went through some tough times, and, obviously we pulled out and did really well in the end. And it just all, it was a fantastic ride, but boy, you feel like you're in one of those, like in a movie where you're like in the airplane flying towards the cliff and trying to pull up, and you're not sure if you're going to make it,
One thing that really strikes me is the lessons from that. And obviously you've taken some things away from that and brought that to Haste. What did you learn from that experience bootstrapping? Did you learn that, maybe finding investors is a good route to go as opposed to bootstrapping? In order to get a product, I would imagine for Haste, you would need some money for developers and things like that. What did you learn from those experiences and carry over to launching Haste?
There are a few things that stand out. You're absolutely right. In the case of Haste, we knew from the beginning, from before we ever even incorporated the company and started talking to investors, that this was going to take a lot of money, because we were talking about infrastructure, because the types of people we needed, the types of engineers we needed were a sort of a rare breed, sort of esoteric, deep networking talent, which is rare and hard to find, and has a price to match, even when you're in a startup scenario with equity. So I knew that raising money would be important. The other thing, the other two things are just to focus. I think I learned a lot about building teams. Again, like open any textbook about entrepreneurship, and on the first page, it'll also, in addition to everything else, it'll talk about team and the importance of people. But really experiencing that, as you say, viscerally, I think, has helped me really tune in to how to do that, and how to kind of smell out the kind of people who are going to make a great team together. And then the last thing that I think I really learned, and this is more just sort of specific to the type of startup that Big Champagne was and that Haste is, I have to control myself to not be too obsessive and to actually be balanced in the end. But my bias is towards just everything being data-driven, right? And so from the very beginning, not only in terms of operating the business, but in terms of the technology itself, we literally don't throw out any data about what happens on our platform. And part of that is because we're still scaling and we're still adding new features. And I'm sure at some point we'll come back and say, okay, we don't need to save, that particular slice of activity because those data are captured in some other way. But and again, this depends on what type of technology you're building, what type of service you're building. Our ethos is just don't ever throw away any piece of data, even if you're not sure or have no idea how you might ever use it. Keep it forever. Eventually, as we get a little further down the road, we'll come back and we'll sort of clean all that up and decide what's really important. But in that first startup, I had a lot of conversations with the team along the way that, sounded something like, well, Adam, if you had told us that, or if we had thought that that particular type of insight into XYZ would have been valuable, it would have been very easy for us to have, built in saving those data, but we didn't. And so we don't have those data. And if you want us to have them going forward, that's that's a big project. Would have been dead simple when we were building the platform, but now it's like a big rework. So
it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Especially these days, right? When storage is so cheap.
Yeah, it really is. And one thing I heard you say was, earlier on, this goes back to earlier on about bootstrapping versus investment. One thing that I think a lot of people try and reconcile is how do you balance the romanticism, I guess, of bootstrapping and do it all your own and having all your own equity with you and your partners versus taking outside money. To me, personally, there's a sense of, I guess, pride or maybe it's romanticism of doing it all your own and creating something that's revenue driven that you can take the money and invest back versus in taking investment money and giving up some of the equity. How would you advise someone to reconcile those two contrasts when they're starting a business or doing anything where they are debating those two ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my first instinct is to say, if you can bootstrap, that's great. But you might consider raising some money anyway. You can raise money, you can raise a very little amount, right? Because if you're able to bootstrap, or if you think you're in a position to bootstrap, then you don't have to raise much and you don't have to give up much equity. But going back to what I was saying earlier about really think about investors as partners. Now, if you're talking about like your Uncle Billy who has a bunch of money because he runs a successful, fill in the blank that has nothing to do with your startup. In other words, if you have access to just capital where there's no strategic value in the input or counsel of the person giving you money, and you don't need it, then don't take it, right? But if you're talking about experienced investors or former operators, think of them as a potential force multiplier, right? So I have a number. I mean, again, I don't want to toot our own horn, but we have great investors. Are very active, and even some of them who aren't necessarily who don't necessarily know a lot about the world of online gaming or esports, but they are smart about SaaS businesses, and I got to tell you, like, the value I get out of our investors goes far beyond money. So if you are in a position to bootstrap, that's great. And maybe the way, one thing you should think about is, hey, if we can find the right investors who can bring a lot of strategic value. And I keep saying strategic value, but let me be more specific. It breaks down into several categories. So the first kind of strategic value can obviously just be advice about running a startup, about building a startup, right? So a lot of investors have seen this movie 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, and they have great pattern recognition and can provide you a lot of insight that can really help you accelerate your thinking and can really help you avoid, rookie mistakes, right? So that's a huge category of value, is sort of just like, leeching off the experience of the investor. So that's one category. Another category, things to think about when you're evaluating investors is, their ability to introduce you either now, or if you're in a scenario where you're, just taking a little bit of money, they can be a bridge to future rounds, right? So even if you're bootstrapping now, maybe once you really got your feet under you and you're ready to, go to the races, you want to raise money to just accelerate what you're doing. The other value that a good investor can bring is connecting you to more and other people when you're ready, right? So in other words, they can help you raise more money in the future by virtue of their connections and by virtue of the sort of legitimacy that their participation communicates to other people in the venture capital world. So that's another area that's important to think about, right? So, there's at least kind of two broad areas, right? Like advice and input from experienced people, and think, forward in terms of future fundraising. And, there's obviously much more to it than that, right? They can introduce you to other companies. They can introduce you, so you think of them as like networking as kind of one of your key points of networking and meeting other people. And so again, so circling back to the person who's thinking about, hey, I think I could bootstrap this, that's great. And maybe you should, but at some point, you should think about smart investors.
Now, what's been the biggest accomplishment for you so far in your career?
Well, I think it's been building great teams and convincing other people to get behind my vision, the vision of my co-founder, Tariq Mirza, and of, really putting together a team sort of top to bottom from great investors to, we have a team at Haste of deeply experienced people who are in a position to, to sort of do what they want, right? They could, they can work for, whatever startup looks attractive to them because they have a sterling reputation in their field, be it, on the networking side or, engineering or, marketing or operations. When you sort of look at who is involved with Haste, it's a lot of people who can kind of punch their own ticket. And so I'm incredibly proud of that. Like that gives me, it makes me feel very humble. It makes me feel like there's a lot of pressure on me. But it also, like, I feel really good about that, right? That we've built a team of both investors and operators who could really be doing kind of whatever they want and who have chosen to be a part of Haste. And I think, right now from where I sit today, that's the thing that really makes me feel great. And maybe, you didn't ask this, but I'll just add, since I'm kind of on that thread, to founders out there, people who are, who are in the middle of building their own businesses, or people who are thinking about building their own businesses. Probably the single smartest thing that you can do is get other people who are smarter than you. And I say smarter in quotes, that might be more experienced. That might mean, know more about a certain subject. It could also mean people who just simply are just flat out smarter than you. Surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, because that will make you better and that will make your company better. And you will learn so much from them. And, I think sometimes people have a, their reaction to that can be sort of defensive, or they feel, threatened by somebody who is going to come in and maybe be, in a subordinate position, but who clearly knows more than they do about something. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable. Get over it. Get over the uncomfortableness and, just seek to hire or partner with people that make you feel like you're the dumbest guy in the room. And I promise you, I guarantee that as long as you are, emotionally able to deal with that, right? As long as you have enough emotional intelligence and you aren't, too, as long as you can deal with that, right?
Yeah, you really have to understand yourself.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, you have to understand yourself and know what your skills are or what your capabilities are.
That's right.
Because you're never going to build anything yourself, of anything of substance, of substantial means or nature. You're never going to build it yourself. So you need people that, if you're an operator, like you are an operator, you have a tremendous, inventor of this technology working with you, who's your co-founder. You guys marry very well because you're an operator and he's, the inventor kind of thing. He's got the technical development skills and you've got the CEO and operator and executive skills, and you have to find people that marry those skills with you, who are who are on the same page with you as far as your thesis or your religion goes, as far as your business. But you got to find people that have skills that you don't have.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think the good news is that the sort of people who are entrepreneurs tend to be sort of self-selected for being good at that, right? Like, I see it all the time, and I really think it's critical. If you aren't surrounding yourself with smart people and people who are challenging you, then you're not doing it right.
Yeah. How can we capitalize on the excitement of esports? You're obviously capitalizing on the need for, reducing lag and latency for online games, because that's a real issue, especially with the way that internet service providers are maybe not, we'll leave that to be determined, but, throttling bandwidth and whatnot and doing some shady things on the wire. But, you guys are taking advantage of that in providing a service to deal with that problem as far as latency goes. But how else can we capitalize on the excitement of esports?
Well, first of all, esports seems to be a juggernaut, right? So, esports is going to continue to grow incredibly quickly because it's this, it's crossing the streams of sports and media and video games, and right at a critical time, right, when things like traditional multi-channel services are starting to be disaggregated by Netflix and by Amazon Prime, and now by some of the channels themselves, right, like HBO. I think, and sorry, the other thing I also, because you were sort of talking about the ISPs. I do want to challenge that a little bit. I'm not here to defend or talk down ISPs or anybody, but our vision of the network and of why there's lag. Certainly there can be problems at the on the ISP side, right? And the ISP is sort of what connects you to the internet, right? It isn't the internet, it's what connects you to the internet. And sure, an ISP, like any service provider, can mess up. A game company, right, can mess up by not having their servers running smoothly, by having too many people on them, whatever. There's plenty of opportunities for everybody in the world to mess up. But fundamentally, the problem, the way that lag is created, and the problem really fundamentally is that the internet itself is really not designed for sustaining high quality real-time connections with low latency over a period of time, right? I don't want to get super technical. I'm not going to get super technical, but just consider that, like, the reason we have Netflix, or the reason that, like, software downloads, can be and frequently are really snappy and quick, think particularly about like game updates and things like that, is because a whole industry emerged to address a kind of underlying problem with the internet, which is that the internet's not very good at pushing media through the network. And that's why we have the content distribution network business, right? The CDN business with Akamai and companies like that, who take, big media files, whether it's a movie or a song or an app update or whatever, and they replicate it and they cache it and they keep copies of it kind of at the edge of the internet where you can access it really quickly without those data having to move kind of through the middle of the internet to get to the end user. And so we start from the same place, right? Which is that the internet is actually kind of not a very well optimized network. And by the way, that's a feature, not a bug, right? The internet is really composed of like more than 55,000 autonomous networks who all agree to kind of share traffic and pass it back and forth. They use a bunch of rules that organizes the way people share traffic, right? And those rules are called TCP/IP. They're called BGP routing. But really, the internet is this giant game of telephone where different autonomous networks are kind of handing off data to each other, and nobody is really looking at the end-to-end connection between a user and an application. They're just kind of handing off data with no idea where it came from or where it's going beyond, who they're handing it off to next, right? And so that makes for a really bad live experience. And so what we're trying to do is build a platform that kind of, in the same way that the content distribution networks built a platform that addresses, rich media in the internet, we're trying to build a platform that anybody can use to build live experiences on. And the reason I went down that little rabbit hole is just to come back to where I started with this, which is to make the point that the way that the internet is structured and the way it was, the way it's organized, which were decisions made 50 years ago, 50, not 15, but 50. That's not the ISP's fault, right? So, look, I mean, I'm not, I have no skin in the game when it comes to ISPs. I'm not in partnership with any of them. We're not making money from it.
Believe me, I get it. I get it.
But it's not always their fault. I get why they take a lot of the blame. It's because they're the service that's connecting you to the internet. But a lot of times when there's nonsense and things aren't working well, it's just because of the internet and because it's this just giant kind of spaghetti mess of a network. But I want to emphasize, that's a feature, not a bug. That's why the internet is such a great platform for innovation. It's because nobody controls it, right? Nobody owns it. Nobody is setting rules that might make it more efficient. And we want that, right? We want the internet to remain open. But that kind of Wild West where anybody can do anything comes with some performance problems. And I think every time you've had like a garbled video chat or something, like that's the price we pay for that openness. I think the price is worth it. We're trying to create a platform that sort of fixes that a little bit, for at least for some applications.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me. And I'm an IT guy by trade, cybersecurity actually. And so, that really makes sense to me. And I do agree that, it's correlation is not always equal to causation, right. But there is, there is some things that, you could get into if you wanted to go down that rabbit hole that we won't. But it's very interesting to hear what you guys are doing at Haste to overcome the latency issues between application and user and over the internet. And I know that, in future shows, maybe we'll have to have you guys on again to talk more technical stuff, because that is something that's really interesting to me. And I think something that's kind of interesting to all the other nerds out there. So I think that would be kind of cool. But
we'd love to. We love talking about our tech, and we're super open about it too. So we are very proud of our technology and all of that, but we also just love talking about it because in the end we're just a bunch of nerds.
Yeah, of course. Now this is the part of the show I call the 5-question combo breaker. It's kind of like a lightning round.
Oh my God! All right.
No worries. So the first question is, what's the best advice someone has ever given you?
Oh my God, don't panic.
What do you think the esports industry needs to continue to grow and be successful?
I think it needs organization, and I think you're seeing that now, right? So it's been a little bit of a Wild West, but when you start to see some of the leagues forming and a little bit more organization, I think that kind of predictability is the key to unlocking more investment in the ecosystem, and that that investment will lead to tremendous growth.
Now, I know you mentioned you weren't super in depth into esports at the outright, but share with us what's been one of the most memorable moments for you in esports or gaming, or maybe a best play you've seen if you're into any specific game. Share with us some sort of highlight moment.
So you're absolutely right that I kind of, early on, I was just, not part of the esports, the active esports community. I do play now. I play, particularly, I love Overwatch, and even though we're not quite supporting the game yet, we all, just as the rest of the world does, we all love PUBG. But to share a memory with you, I'm actually going to go way, way back to when I was a kid, and I used to play a game called Ultima that had many iterations, and I still have this incredible memory of the first time that I played Ultima online. And I don't even think it was like multiplayer. I don't even think I was connecting with people. But just the notion that I was playing this game that I already knew and loved, but I was connecting and playing it over the internet, was amazing to me. And that maybe dates me a little bit, but I still remember that, and that sense of reaching out into the world and of connecting to something much bigger than myself was really powerful feeling.
What's one specific action step that anybody can take today to get started, either, with their business, let's say, if for advice for someone who's looking to start their business, what's one specific step that they could take today, to get started on that journey?
I think it's incredibly useful to craft a elevator pitch. And the reason I think that that's useful is not because you're going to immediately turn around and have your sort of 30 seconds to pitch an investor. That may take more time. But the discipline of going through just with yourself and a blank sheet of paper or a microphone, use your voice notes app on your phone, and come up with a very, very succinct, like you should be able to say it in like under 20 seconds, very succinct encapsulation of what your business is, right? And it's not just, and so, maybe you can start with like, what's your idea, and boil it down to, why do people care, and why would someone care, and what's powerful about it. But maybe, but ultimately what you want to get to is like a 20 to 30 second, very clear and concise articulation of what is my business? What am I building? If you can't articulate it in a really short amount of time, then maybe it's not as clear in your head as you think it is, right? It's one thing for all of us to have the great idea in our head, right? Like who doesn't, what movie fan doesn't have an incredible movie in their head, right? But like, the point is not to have an incredible movie in your head. It's to deliver a script that successfully captures what that incredible movie is. And so in that same way, I would say work on your elevator pitch and then practice it, right? Practice it on your friends, on your family, but especially people who might sort of have some sense of what you're talking about, right? Like to this day, my parents have no idea what Haste is, right? They're super supportive and they love it, but like, and they don't really know what it is.
Sure.
And so, also try that pitch out on everybody, but especially try it on people who might actually know what you're talking about too.
Yeah. What's one daily habit that's been the biggest factor for your success?
Getting good sleep.
All right. That's good advice.
Well, and I think it's good advice, like that maybe more people in the startup world should heed, right? Like, and it depends. If you're 22, or 18 or 16 for that matter, and you're working on your startup and you can get by on 4 hours of sleep a night and you're, just banging it out, good for you. But,
And it depends what you do when you're awake, too. Like, everybody's got the same 24 hours. I mean, there's a lot of time wasted, probably. I mean, there's a lot of time wasted in my day, on, silly things here and there. And I have to keep reminding myself to stay focused on, what it is I'm trying to achieve.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. Just, look, I mean, like, as people say about a lot of things in life, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Sleep is important. Now, all I'm really doing is telling you that for me, getting a lot of sleep is really important. And there's clearly people out there who can survive on much less. But however much sleep you need, tend to your sleep. Get rest, right? Like, that's really important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And you got to know yourself and your body and how much you can go on.
That's right.
If you were now, we'll share a little bit of a closing wisdom with everyone, and we'll talk about where we can engage with you online. But if you were just getting started today with your startup, or maybe in your startup career, your entrepreneurial career, what would it look like? What would your life look like 30, 60, 90 days, a year from now if you were just getting started? And let's put the focus on the esports industry, a startup in the esports industry for emphasis for the show.
Well, I think that you need to spend a lot of time being a part of the community, obviously, right? Like, you don't want to just bolt on some idea or technology from outside the community, because esports and gaming, for those same reasons we were talking about, where it's incredibly social, it really is a community in a lot of ways, that has its own language, that has its own customs, right? So I think you are immersing yourself in that space. But I guess if we, let's assume you already have, right, and that's why you're starting this, then I think the next thing that I would be doing is I would be, there are a lot of newsletters and websites that are providing really good coverage of esports, and I'm sure if people were interested, we could post those on your website, or give people a way to find a bunch of those. But hey, there's Google, right? So there's so really immersing yourself in what's happening from you want to look at it from the perspective of the publishers, right? The people who are making the games. You want to look at it from the perspective of the leagues, right? You want to look at it from the perspective of the tournaments. You want to look at it from the perspective of obviously the players, and become again, I'm sort of going back and forth between the person who's getting involved with this because they're already a part of the community versus somebody who's interested in learning more. But for that latter category, start watching a lot of Twitch and a lot of YouTube. Watch people playing games. Watch people's shows about other people playing games, right? And start to really understand the kind of dynamic of what this thing is, because it's sort of a spectator sport, and through one lens, it's a spectator sport. It's also a social experience. It's also a, competition. And it's, it's all of these things, and sort of understanding all of those aspects. I think immersing yourself in all of that, I think it would be really important for anybody who's developing anything in this space. Look, I mean, I don't know that that's great advice. I think in the end that's kind of obvious. Like, yeah, immerse yourself in the space you're in. And some of that I think reflects that I kind of came in to esports a couple of years ago, right? And sort of learned about it from the outside. But yeah, I think that's super important.
Where can the listeners engage with you and Haste, and where can they reach out and be a part of the community?
Well, the easiest thing to do is come to haste.net, and from there you will find links to our Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Most importantly, I think though, for people who really want to learn about what we're up to, and you can also get all of this from our website, is join us on our Discord channels. Come and talk to us, or don't even talk to us. Talk to the other people who are using Haste, or just lurk around. But I think you'll find that we have a great social experience around games that isn't exclusive to any one game or any one experience, and I think that's really fun. And then, look, because of the way the internet works, Haste and our network optimization kind of works differently for everybody. For some people, they just have a great internet connection and they don't really need Haste, Other people, we change their life from a perspective of lag. And other people have experiences everywhere in between. The point is that, you don't really know how powerful the tool will be for you until you try it. And that's why Haste is always totally free and easy for anybody to try. There's no credit card to sign up for a trial or any of that nonsense. Really, you just, create a username and a password. We do ask you to verify an email address, and that's it. And then you have a 2-week trial that is where you can really understand how Haste works for you. If you get referred by a friend who uses Haste, you get a 4-week trial. Bottom line is, just come try it out, right? There's literally there's no friction to trying it out. We love people's feedback. Some of the most valuable feedback we've gotten is from people who say, hey, it looks like things are a little more stable. I'm not getting spikes and I'm not getting as much packet loss, but it didn't seem to, necessarily change my latency all that much. My ping didn't go down that much, but that's some of the best feedback we get. And even if, Haste is sort of not for you and you don't want to kind of move into a premium tier, the tool is actually free, right? And so you get Haste Check, which is kind of like a bandwidth speed test app, except instead of your megabits, it tells you your latency and jitter and packet loss to a game server, and that's always free. And if you just leave Haste installed, you can earn free acceleration. There's kind of no downside, and there's none of this give us a credit card, and if you forget, we'll start billing you. There's none of that BS. And there will never be any of that BS, because in the end, what we really want to do is build a great community. And for people for whom, who we're really fixing a network problem for, that's great. And there's an opportunity for them to subscribe to the service. But we're trying to do something much bigger than that, and would just love people to come and tell us what they think.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam, for coming on the show and sharing your esports narrative with me and all the listeners. Definitely provided some really good value and some insight and a lot of good wisdom into the business and startup world of esports and what you're doing. And just really appreciate you coming on the show and taking some time with us.
Hey, thanks so much, Spencer. This was really great, and I hope we get a chance to chat somewhere down the road. And I really appreciate the interest. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I just want to remind everyone that if this all goes as planned, this show is just the beginning. Thank you, listeners. I really appreciate you. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating on iTunes. I would love a 5-star, but if you think I deserve a 1, let me have it and tell me why. 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 And tell me